Over the past decade, many different approaches came about in order to help us understand and explain human behavior and the human condition. We're going to focus on 5 areas for the purpose of this exam. The first approach that we focus on is the biological approach. In this approach, we understand that physiological and biochemical explanations are at the root of all of our behaviors. Meaning, it is genetics, it is the hormones in our body, it is neurotransmitters and neurochemicals that are the root of human behavior and human emotion. And it is through the combination of these biological functions that humans experience their emotions, behaviors, thoughts, and physiological experiences. A second approach is that of the behaviorists. The behaviorist approach focuses on learned responses to predictable patterns of external stimuli. What that means is that we respond to our environment and behave in various ways based on what the environment is bringing towards us. There are 2 classic theorists behind this approach. Ivan Pavlov, who focused on classical conditioning. He did a lot of his research with dogs who would salivate into a bowl. And after drooling into a bowl, eventually he would remove the bowl and show them food and see if they would drool. And he learned from this approach that they learned to pair the bowl of food with the food itself. And this led Pavlov to develop his classical conditioning approach, which we'll talk about later on in a future module. B.F. Skinner is the other individual from the behaviorist school who focused on operant conditioning. This is where Skinner contributed the ideas of rewards and punishments and how those affect our behaviors. Another approach is that of the psychodynamic school of thought, mostly initiated by Sigmund Freud in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Sigmund Freud spoke about the role that unmet needs and desires, as well as conflicts that arise up in us from childhood, and their effect on us as adults in later development. He basically said that unconscious elements in our psyche, as well as ways of attaching to our parents when we were younger, really play a role throughout our entire lives. And these interpersonal dynamics were at the bedrock of Freud's dynamic theories. Freud focused on 3 particular areas. These elements that he referred to as the id, the ego, and the superego basically are what make up the human psyche. The id operating under the pleasure principle, I want it, and I want it now. The superego, which is very much about morals and values. We can't do that. That could be dangerous for us, so we have to follow the rules of society. And the ego, which is the great moderator between the id and the superego, which operates on the reality principle. Freud also spoke about the role of defense mechanisms such as repression, suppression, reaction formation, and sublimation as playing a key role in forming our personalities. And finally, Freud spoke at length about sexual urges and aggressive drives that motivate and direct our behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. The next school of thought that we'll focus on is the cognitive approach. This school rose up in reaction to the behaviorists, who had focused primarily on the observable expectations and the observable reactions in our environment. And the cognitive school focused on elements that you couldn't necessarily track or observe externally, but yet were certainly occurring underneath the surface. So they spoke about memory, they talk about attention, they contributed greatly to understanding various thought processes, all from the cognitive approach. Finally, The last school of thought is the humanistic approach. The humanistic approach also developed in reaction to previous schools, such as the behaviorist and the psychodynamic school. Both the behaviorist and psychodynamic school seem to tell us that we don't have much of a choice in what happens to us. Psychodynamics are telling you that by 3 years old, your personality is locked in. Behaviorists are saying you don't have free will, you're reacting to your environment, to rewards and punishment. But the humanistic school came about to say we do have free will. And in fact, we are motivated to grow. We are motivated to develop into higher order and high functioning beings. The two people to contribute mostly to this school are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Abraham Maslow focused on the hierarchy of needs. In this approach, he spoke about our drive to rise up the ladder from basic physiological needs such as food, and then moving up to safety, all the way up to love and belonging, esteem, and finally at the top of the pyramid, self-actualization, the ability to become a full, functioning, and enlightened individual. Lastly, we have Carl Rogers from the humanistic school, who believed that people are basically good in their nature. Unlike Freud, who said that we are nihilistic and destructive in our nature, Rogers said that we are all driven by an unconditional positive regard, meaning a drive to reach for positivity in a non-judgmental way, unconditionally. These were the contributors to the humanistic approach, and we have just finished covering 5 different schools of thought that have resulted in the past century's advancement in psychology.